They were told to point the brush with their lips. Years later, teeth loosened, jaws crumbled, and their own bones helped prove the job was killing them. When we think of the roaring 20s, we picture jazz spilling from cellar clubs, fringed dresses spinning on packed dance floors, assembly lines cranking out Model Ts with clean American muscle. But in Orange, New Jersey, there was another kind of factory floor. The United States Radium Corporation hired working-class girls to paint tiny glowing numerals onto wristwatch faces. The job was considered a privilege, a step up from scrubbing floors and emptying chambermaid buckets. Young women like Grace Fryer and Catherine Schaub arrived each morning, grateful for the work. Every morning, Grace Fryer sat down at a long wooden bench, her station laid out with a shallow dish of radioluminescent paint. The mixture was simple: radium sulfate, zinc sulfide, and a binder that held it all together. The brush was a wisp of camel hair, fine enough to trace numerals thinner than an eyelash. And here's what the supervisors taught the girls to do. After each stroke, you put the brush tip between your lips. A quick, practiced purse of the mouth, and the bristles snapped to a perfect point. They called it lip pointing. The women did it hundreds of times a day. It sounds unthinkable now, but in the early 1920s, radium was sold as a wonder. It was the wonder element, the cure for everything. Pharmacies sold radium-infused face creams. Radium toothpaste sat on bathroom shelves. People drank radium water for their health. So when the dial painters finished a shift and noticed their skin glowing faintly in the dark, when their hair sparkled under the street lamps on the walk home, they laughed about it. Their dresses, their fingers, the very dust motes floating in stale factory air, all carried that soft green luminescence. What none of them could see was that each tiny, almost ritualistic lick was depositing microscopic flecks of radioactive material into their mouths. From there, it absorbed through the gums and began its slow migration deeper into the bone. The poisoning worked on a cruel chemical trick. Your body constantly remodels its skeleton, tearing out old bone cells and laying down fresh mineral scaffolding. And when it goes looking for calcium, radium looks close enough to fool it. So the dial painters' bodies did what bodies do. They pulled the radioactive atoms from the women's bloodstreams and packed them directly into their living bone, lacing it through the jaw, the spine, the femur. Once anchored there, the radium began emitting alpha particles, a ceaseless, invisible bombardment at the molecular level. This wasn't a surface burn. It was cellular butchery from the inside. The first damage always showed up in the mouth, because that was the original entry point. Teeth loosened in their sockets for no apparent reason. Gums bled and wouldn't heal until the raw bone underneath was exposed to open air. The bone took on a strange, moth-eaten look, like something was chewing its way through from within. When a dentist pulled a bad tooth, often the whole section of jaw came away with the root, crumbling like wet chalk in his fingers. The medical journals gave it a name, radium jaw. But before any of these horrors became visible, the women were already walking through the streets of Orange as radioactive beacons. Later tests could detect radium in living bodies and breath, proof that the danger had moved inside them long before anyone could see it. To understand the violence of what happened, keep the scale human and cumulative. The dial painters were not poisoned by one dramatic swallow. They were exposed through repeated lip pointing, tiny flecks of radium paint entering the mouth day after day, shift after shift, until the dose settled into bone. That slow rhythm made the danger easier for companies to deny. A woman did not collapse the first afternoon. She earned wages, laughed with coworkers, walked home with glowing dust on her clothes, and only later faced tooth pain, anemia, jaw damage, fractures, tumors, and exhaustion that doctors struggled or refused to connect to the bench. Company doctors and consultants had every incentive to look elsewhere. Some women were diagnosed with syphilis, a smear that turned occupational poisoning into personal shame. Others were dismissed, replaced, or told the work was safe. The comparison to a famous assassination is the wrong frame. This was not espionage. It was industrial exposure disguised as respectable employment. The horror is that each lick was small enough to feel harmless, and the accumulation was large enough to wreck a life. Slow poisoning is harder to dramatize than sudden violence, but it is exactly why the denial lasted so long in plain sight for years. Here is where the pattern truly shatters. The suffering did not stay neatly on the factory floor. Radium dust clung to clothing, hair, hands, benches, and the ordinary route home. Some women treated the glow playfully before anyone around them understood the cost. That detail matters because it shows how thoroughly the danger had been misrepresented. A glow that supervisors and advertisements framed as modern, healthy, and almost glamorous became a private joke among workers who had no reason to know it was evidence of contamination. The company side looked different. Scientists and managers in radium industries increasingly used precautions for handling concentrated material, while dial painters were still told lip pointing was acceptable. That double standard is the ugliest part. The people with access to technical knowledge had ways to shield themselves. The young women doing the delicate brushwork were given confidence instead of protection. Waste, dust, and residue around the plant also created a longer environmental problem. The point is not one outrageous prank or one glowing puddle behind the building. The point is structural duplicity. The same substance treated as dangerous in expert hands was sold as harmless when it passed through working women's mouths. Knowledge was divided by class and job title, and that division became lethal. Grace Fryer was not a scientist, a lawyer, or a person with much institutional power. She was a former dial painter whose body had begun to tell the truth more clearly than the company wanted to hear it. As pain, weakness, and bone damage spread, she and other New Jersey workers tried to turn private suffering into a legal case. That took years of persistence because delayed occupational disease is easy for a company to fight. The exposure happened earlier. The symptoms appeared later. The law could be made to ask whether the clock had already run out before the women even understood what had been done to them. Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, Albina Laris, and Edna Hussman became public faces of that fight not because they wanted spectacle, but because privacy had failed them. They had to sit in front of doctors, lawyers, reporters, and the public while their injuries were measured, doubted, and debated. The courage was not a cinematic stare across a courtroom. It was continuing when the process itself was humiliating, slow, and exhausting. They forced a company, a court, and a country to confront a simple question. If a job kills slowly, should the law be allowed to pretend the injury arrived too late to count? The evidence that changed industrial law was not a single courtroom stunt. It was a body of measurement. Harrison Martland and other investigators helped show that radium was inside the women, not merely on them. Teeth, bones, breath measurements, autoradiographs, and radiation counters turned suffering into proof a company could not wave away as nerves or morality. That mattered because the women had already been asked to prove the obvious from inside bodies that were failing them. A tooth or bone fragment could expose radiation tracks. Breath tests could show radon and radium decay products associated with internal contamination. Public testimony did the other half of the work. The women described lip pointing, factory routines, glowing dust, pain, and the slow betrayal of being told the job was safe. The room did not need a perfect cinematic click to become damning. It needed enough science, enough testimony, and enough public attention to make denial look like what it was. If you are following this story, subscribe before we go deeper, because the next section is where one woman's death turns from private tragedy into evidence. Measurement gave their testimony teeth, and testimony gave the measurements a human voice no consultant could politely erase from the public record ever again. Amelia Maggia shows why the early deaths were so hard to bury inside company language. She had worked with the same luminous paint, and when her mouth began to fail, the symptoms looked at first like ordinary dental misery. Teeth were pulled. Sockets did not heal. Infection, exposed bone, anemia, and pain followed. Her death was officially blamed in ways that deflected attention from work, including the cruel stigma of venereal disease. That mislabeling mattered. It let an industrial injury be read as personal shame. Later investigation and testing helped connect cases like hers back to radium exposure, showing that the danger had entered bone and remained measurable after death. We do not need to pretend every object glowed theatrically in a drawer to make the horrorland. The real point is stronger. A young woman's body carried evidence that experts and employers had refused to interpret honestly while she was alive. Once radium inside tissue could be measured, the story changed. The women were not hysterical, they were not morally suspect. They had been poisoned by a job sold to them as safe. That correction came too late for her, but it made future denial much harder, even when officials resisted. Not soon enough to save her. In the midst of the horror, there is a detail that feels almost impossible now. Before many of them became sick, some dial painters liked the glow. Public accounts describe young women treating the luminosity as a novelty, letting dust sparkle on clothes, hair, fingernails, or teeth because the company had taught them that radium was safe and modern. That playfulness should not be used to mock them. It should make us furious on their behalf. They were not reckless chemists. They were workers inside a culture that sold radium as health, beauty, progress, and wonder. The factory floor could feel social, even cheerful. Girls talked, joked, sang, compared wages, and practiced the quick mouth-pointing motion that made the tiny numbers neat. That is what makes the story heartbreaking. The disaster did not look like a disaster while it was happening. It looked like respectable work. It looked clean compared with coal mines or slaughterhouses. It paid better than many jobs open to young women. The glow was marketed as proof of modern life, and the people carrying it home had been denied the knowledge that would have turned charm into alarm. That is why the glow is so devastating. It shows trust before betrayal, not foolishness before consequence. The medical establishment was slow to act, partly because corporate pressure met a culture already dazzled by radium. Radium therapy and radium products were fashionable in the early 20th century. Toothpaste, cosmetics, tonics, and quack cures borrowed the language of science and sold it back as health. Radithor, the infamous radium water that helped kill Eben Byers, shows how far the craze reached. So when dial painters developed lesions, anemia, jaw decay, and pain, the first instinct was not always to blame the factory. Some doctors blamed infection, bad teeth, personal behavior, or venereal disease. That last accusation was especially cruel because it converted an occupational injury into a moral stain. The women had to fight not only for compensation, but for the right to have their symptoms interpreted honestly. The scientific question was simple in hindsight. What happens when a calcium-like radioactive element lodges in living bone? But hindsight arrived late. Until measurement caught up, the women were asked to carry proof in bodies already damaged by the very thing being denied. The battle was legal, medical, and reputational all at once. Shaming them was cheaper than redesigning the job, and shame bought the company time while more women kept working at those benches every week afterward. The modern comparison should be handled carefully, because not every industrial hazard is the same as radium paint. But the pattern is familiar enough to sting. A useful product enters daily life. Workers handle the risky part. The harm is slow, hard to see, and easy to dispute. Companies argue over causation, timing, and responsibility, while sick people try to prove that an invisible exposure is real. That is why Ray Grace Fryer's legal barrier matters. If the injury appears years after exposure, a statute of limitations can become more than a technical rule. It can become a shield for delayed harm. We still see this problem whenever toxic exposure, occupational disease, or environmental contamination takes years to reveal itself. The hard question is not whether law needs deadlines. It does. The hard question is what justice means when the poison keeps time differently than the court. If you had been asked to judge the radium case in 1928, would you treat the legal clock as final? Or would the measurable evidence inside the women's bones force the clock to be reconsidered? That is why delayed harm needs laws that can still hear evidence when the body speaks late, after paychecks and paperwork have already moved on. That matters. The afterlife of the Radium Girls story continued long after the first lawsuits. Later researchers studying internally deposited radium examined exposed workers, old records, and in some cases human remains, because the material persisted in bone for years. That research helped refine understanding of internal emitters, bone dose, cancer risk, radon decay products, and the grim timeline of occupational exposure. The details are haunting enough without inventing a secret horror lab scene. Radium does not need theatrics. It remains measurable because physics keeps its own archive. A woman could be gone, her workplace closed, her legal fight reduced to a footnote, and still the element inside her skeleton could testify. That is the deep lesson. Industrial harm can outlast employment, publicity, and even death. The glow demanded respect because it kept speaking encounters, plates, samples, and medical studies. The women had been told the paint was harmless because the damage was invisible at first. Decades later, the invisibility was gone. Instruments could hear what their employers refused to hear. The job had entered their bones. Physics kept the record power tried to erase, and later measurements made that record harder to ignore in court, medicine, labor law, workplace safety, public health, and memory. The glow had become testimony. But we have to honor the light these women sparked in the darkness of labor law, because they did win something real. In 1928, weakened and close to death, Grace Fryer and other New Jersey dial painters reached a settlement that brought money, medical care, and public admission that the work had harmed them. It was not enough to restore their bodies, and it did not instantly fix every workplace, but the publicity cracked open a door. Their case influenced occupational disease compensation, statutes of limitation, employer liability, and the idea that a workplace injury can reveal itself years after exposure. Later safety standards around radioactive materials moved far away from teenage girls licking brushes at benches. No single case invented every modern toxic tort pathway, and no one reform was clean or immediate. The legacy is broader and more honest. These women helped force law, medicine, and industry to recognize that invisible exposure can be real injury. If workplace dignity matters to you, subscribe and stay with this channel. Stories like this are not only about past cruelty, they are about how proof gets built when power profits from doubt. Their victory was limited, but limited victories can still change the map for everyone who comes after them. That matters. There is an image of Grace Fryer from the years when the fight had already taken a visible toll. She looks fragile, but not erased. That is the truest image of the industrial age. Not only the roaring engine or glowing dial, but the body that absorbed the hidden cost of progress. The factory dust that once sparkled on dresses became evidence. The jokes about glowing hair became testimony. The teeth, bones, measurements, and lawsuits became part of the record that changed how workplaces handle invisible hazards. So as you look at a glowing screen tonight, or the luminous dial of a modern instrument, remember what it cost to prove that a worker's glowing smile was not health, glamour, or modern illusion. It was exposure. It was a warning misread on purpose. Tell me in the comments which detail from this story you will never forget. Because remembering is one small way to refuse the industry's original plan. Make the product shine, make the workers disappear. The light was evidence.